Welcome to this presentation by the master students in the course IT and Society. My name is Birgitta Wargren and I'm the contact person between EPG, the Unit for Electronic Patient Record at Region Uppsala, and the Department of Information Technology at the University of Uppsala. So EPG have an agreement of cooperation with this institution. The purpose of the cooperation is to provide knowledge, methods and recommendations for how IT implementation and IT usage can be supported and evaluated. Through method development, studies and seminars, we will together contribute to efficient and useful IT support and good working environment. And one of the activities every year is that we provide the students in this course, IT and Society, with a real problem for them to investigate. And the goal of IT and Society course is to give theoretical and practical knowledge of the interaction between technology, users, organization based on relevant knowledge in human computer science and psychology and system constructions. So really important thing is to know how projects are conducted in practice in society. This is a very short course. It's only 15 credits and it's a master level. And it starts in September and ends now, so it's 3 months. The first year we had this course together, the students looked into how could we present the EMR on internet to citizens and patients. In the second year, we asked how patient home monitoring could work. And last year, they had the subject, the EMR of the future, 2025. So we have quite different subjects. And this year, it's the first year that the hospital has put the question to this course. The university also collaborates with American universities. Last year we had 2, and this year we have 1. And then send the students here and the supervisors, so it's placed in Uppsala. So they have been here 1 week and now they are here again. And this year we welcome 9 students and teacher Karen Axel from Rose-Harmon Institute of Technology. You're so welcome. Nice to have you here. And before then I let the next speaker in, I just like to give some practical information. We have coffee break like fika in the middle. It's outside here, about 20 minutes, and you have the toilets down the hall to the left. Then I want Magnus Larsson, Chief Digital Officer, to say something about the given assignment. Magnus?
As the majority of you know, we have this future project, Future of Akademiska Sjukhuset, Framtidens Akademiska Sjukhus, which is a big development and refurbishing project here at the hospital. And as part of that, we have done a set of pre-studies into digital development within flow management, for instance, and registration, and where positioning is one of them. And we have done a pre-study, and we were curious to see if the students, which is of a different generation, doesn't belong to the hospital, would come up with something more interesting and better than the pre-study did. So this is an attempt to see if we can benchmark our work, and the work the students have done will also lead to investment project into positioning systems here. So this is the starting point and your end point. So
my name is Chance Becker. I'm Albert Sundqvist.
I'm Tyler Graham. I'm Nino. I'm Seiji Takagi. I'm Sean Sote.
And all of us are from various schools and universities, as in Rose-Harmon Institute of Technology and Uppsala University. So we're very glad that we are here and that you've given us the opportunity to do this. So a few things I want to make clear before the presentation. You can ask a question. Of course, feel free to raise your hand and say, hey, listen, what's this mean? But if you have a computer or a cell phone on you, you can go to that link, which will be displayed throughout the presentation, and then ask a question. We will see the questions pop up here, and then we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. However, if we use a word that just doesn't make sense or something, feel free to raise your hand. Or if you have an immediate question that you would like answered immediately, then raise your hand and then we'll get to you right away. So without further ado, let's proceed. So just an introduction to the team. Once again, it's made up of Uppsala University students and Rosholmen Institute of Technology students. It's an international team, and we're made of various majors, computer science majors, IT majors, a mechanical engineering person. So there's quite a diverse team that we have here. So once again, we've been working on this project since early September to now, and this presentation is the culmination of our efforts. So to give you a brief overview of the task, our team was asked to look into the problem of tracking medical personnel, supplies, equipment, and patients. We were to identify how these assets move throughout a hospital and develop some ways to improve these movements. One of the major focuses of the project was automating how assets are found. That is, avoiding manual input of asset locations as somebody going in and writing down the location or having to go into the computer and type it. All that should be automated. So here's going to be a brief outline of the presentation we have set forth for you. So we will start by explaining how we approached our given task. We will then go on to discuss the various needs of the hospital in terms of tracking people, equipment, and supplies. Then we will explain the how technologies we found could be used in a locating system, complying with regulations, ethical concerns, and security concerns of implementing such a system. Then we will discuss several examples of how asset tracking systems have been implemented at other medical institutions. So, here's the approach. The team was broken down into two groups. The first group, referred to as people, focused on human assets, such as medical personnel and patients. The other, referred to as equipment, focused on physical assets, such as equipment and supplies. This distinction was made because of the further legislation that is associated with tracking actual individuals versus a wheelchair or an IV pump or something like that. So each group was broken down into two subgroups. There was a technology subgroup, which looked at what technologies would work best for tracking people and things, while the ethics team examined the legislation associated with tracking people or tracking things. So to reduce duplicate research, these four subgroups utilized an online databases to not step on each other's toes and whatnot. So additionally, each technology to be discussed has been extensively researched through the web in various research papers, as well as case studies done in other hospitals and other applications. So just to give you all an example of this patient flow here. A man injures his leg and he's out with his friends and he trips and his leg is now injured and he needs medical attention. He needs transport to the hospital. So he's with his friends, so he's like, guys, you need to drive me, help me. So that's what happens. His friends drive him to the hospital. And now he has to find out, after they get parking and stuff, he's over there hobbling, trying to get into the hospital so that he can get some attention. So that takes care of the parking node, so to speak. The navigation part has to do with, well, where do I go? One area where our system could help that out, or not our system, but a hypothetical system, would be an application, a map that says, oh, here's where you can go. Here's an area where you can navigate to. Here's where you can get some attention. So that actually looks at the locating room area. I know I have a pointer here. I should be using how that works. How nice. So in terms of the doctors and the hospital side, once they get there, once they have the patient there, they say, okay, we know what to do. We just need the things to do it. So they go in and they see there's a lot of equipment missing. They say, where has all this gone? We need some equipment that we do not have right now. Using a hypothetical system, that would solve that problem. Also, say that there is a nurse who is tending to the patient, and we're going to show a film that kind of outlines the scenario as well. If there is a nurse who has, how can I say this, who is, the patient's injuries are beyond his skill set, then he says, okay, I need to go find a doctor, someone who actually knows what they're doing. That's where this comes in as well. Then the patient gets treatment, and all is well. So the team identified 3 groups of people that could be located, and Shine is going to discuss these kinds of people.
So again, as Chad, thank you, presented, we have 3 different categories of people. Now, these precisely would be the caregivers, patients, and others. So who are in these respective groups? In the caregivers, we have the doctors, we have the nurses, we have the volunteers, and other technical medical staff. So an example of this, where we could implement our hypothetical system, would be a doctor, and we want to find him for a surgery. And this is something we also saw in a lot of the interviews we did with the staff, that a lot of times we need to find them at the right place, at the right time, in order to make the procedure go as smoothly as possible. And unfortunately, this is a problem that's recurring as long as we talk about this. The second group, the patients, would include anyone, as self-explanatory as the title is, anyone who's admitted to the hospital. And well, it can be further categorized based on age, condition, and ward. So an example here would be a ward that patient is based in, and obviously here, compared to the first category, we would need exactly to know where this patient is, like in which room exactly. It would be okay with knowing in which ward they are in. A second example of this would be, and we've noticed this as well with our interviews that we conducted, that from the psychiatric ward, it tends to be people who are missing. That's something we don't want. So how do we locate those people? That would be also an example we could implement this system. And lastly, we have the others. Who would be in this group? This would be the maintenance staff, the security, and the visitors. And here, well, we would have the least need for precision. It would be as simple as knowing the check-in and the check-out of these people in this category. Simple as that. Now, Albin's going to present you with the equipment and supplies.
Hello. Yes, so it's equipment and supplies as well as people. So Uppsala University Hospital, beside tracking medical equipment and supplies upon arrival and during location throughout the campus. Wheelchairs, stretchers, medication, surgical equipment, and various biometric monitors were examples of equipment that must be overseen according to our study visits and interviews. The medical technology and IT departments is responsible for roughly 10,000 pieces of equipment. And every 2 to 3 years, pieces of equipment are to be returned for maintenance. And this maintenance is how they know that the item is missing. So when it's time for checkup, they will ask a ward they think have the piece of equipment, and they will have to, if there is not there, they will have to look for it in other wards. Although some wards have a specialized system for tracking their equipment, like the sterilization unit, it has a system for checkups where every item is scanned into the system at each stage of the sterilization process. And once again, it's returned to the operating room. And after use, it's immediately sent to the process again. And this is very effective. They know exactly where the equipment is, but it's time consuming. And yeah, it can definitely be improved. So we have internal and external. And internal refers to what's normally inside hospital, such as wheelchairs and hospital beds. And like I said, if items go missing now, you have to go look for them manually. There are exceptions to this, but it could be still be improved. And according to our study visits, one major item that needs to be tracked were wheelchairs. Another issue was medical supplies, because medical staff only knew that they ran out of supply when they were checking for it. And when they order a resupply, they also didn't know if it would end up in the right ward. Then we have the external, where we have ambulances, helicopters, which have a really nice positioning system. But it could also be if we know, like Magnus told us this example, but it was if we know the location of a emergency caller, we could with like 80% likelihood know that it was a heart attack case if we know its location. So an example, we can take a wheelchair as an example, where each entrance kept a stockpile of wheelchairs, and wheelchairs were often moved without being returned. A location system would alleviate the need of manually search through the buildings in order to find missing wheelchairs. At some point, they were even completely removed from the building. But without a location system, you couldn't know if the wheelchair were completely gone, like if someone had taken them home with them, or if it's just been moved to another ward. With the implementation of a tracking system for medical equipment and supplies said, it can be used to improve allocation of equipment as well. For instance, interviews indicated that insulin pumps were used in multiple wards. However, not all wards needed the insulin pumps, have the same need for insulin pumps. So, shown by trend, pumps could be taken from one ward to another, and a tracking system of medical supplies would be able to identify which wards need the most need for insulin pumps, and which wards need less, allowing the medical technology departments to reassign insulin pumps to those wards with a greater need. We believe that a location system will cause reduced time looking for items. Items will not go missing as often, and you also know exactly when an item is missing, not maybe wait 1 year and then you notice that it's gone. And it also, like I said in the last example, improve resource allocation. So with that said, we're gonna present you some technologies that we found in our research that would allow this. So first, Shani's gonna tell us something about the basic layout of location system.
Yeah, thank you. So I thought it would be a good idea to initially do an idea like, how does this work? And so, I'll explain it shortly. So usually when we have these type of technologies, we have a tag and then we have a sensor. And as you can figure out, it's with the tag, you would attach it to something or someone that would track wheelchair, staff members, and then you have the sensor that the signal will be transmitted to. And then if you think about this thing, is then you know exactly where they are, where it is, and you have real-time location. So what does real-time mean? That's something you will know instantly, right now, live, where it is. And this is something that we also thought would be pretty good to have displayed on either your smartphone or big screens like this around the hospital, depending on what you're looking at, of course. And, well, say, for example, staff member wants to look, okay, this item has gone missing, where can I find it? Or where has it been earlier, before I'm going to use it right now? Okay, it was in this specific ward. Okay, good, then I know. And this would be used by having the data recording. So, it's pretty good. So, we have the first technology, the barcodes, as we all might be familiar with. It's something that is used widely in healthcare, and what it basically does is that you scan, and what the barcode can attach either to a person, which is usually what's going on around here in this hospital, or you can attach it to something, again, a bed, wheelchair, you name it. And then you will have the total medical information from that, the record, all of it, simply scanning. So an example of this would be, say a nurse goes to administer a drug to a patient. There's three things going on here. So, first, ensures that the medication has not already been administered at the correct time and dosage. You don't want to have overdose of something, obviously, or underdose for that matter. Second, it would instantly document the information to the patient's medical information record. That would be something that would be really good to use later on, depending on what kind of condition the patient is in. And lastly, third, it also documents the employee's actions. And this data is then stored in a database for later use. And this data also coincides with the respective barcode, so it matches. And well, this is both less to error prone, and it tracks the work of the employees. So depending on your colleague have done something, then you know beforehand, oh, okay, my colleague has done this, and then there's no need to reuse this. Obviously, with all of these technologies, there's cons and there's pros. Cons with this takes a lot of time scanning each item, scanning each patient. It takes a lot of time. And what would the pros be? Inexpensive. It's also easy to produce on a massive scale and integrate, whether that's attaching it on a patient or the item you want to track. Second technology, RFID, stands for Radio Frequency Identification. So what this does, I just mentioned earlier, is use a tag and a sensor. And the tags are containing a serial number. Of course, there's more to it than just serial numbers. And what it does is that it uses active tags and passive tags. On both of these have a unique serial number, which is then received by an RFID reader, the transmission and then the reader. And yes, it's stored in a database for the use later on, depending on what you want to do with information. So how does these work? So the passive tag, for example, is, say for example, you have perhaps seen it a lot of times, we never talk about it. Passive tag will work in such a way that you have your card and then you punch it like this, and then it scans. That's all there is to it. The active tag, compared to the passive tag, shows real-time location. The live data I showed totally passive. And it works up until 30 meters. And this works until locating people and things. And this is something that's already been done in a hospital in Japan, Sanraku Hospital in Tokyo, to be more precise, where they have integrated the system into patients' wristbands. Yes. And obviously, here again, we have pros and cons. So, what's the cons? Well, first, the cons for the passive tag. It can't be used for real-time information. But it has the same scanning feature as barcodes. It's more expensive. Again, it's the transmitter and the receiver. You have the barcode where you simply just scan it. The pros for the active would be obviously the real-time information. You want to know instantly. Where is it? Then you know. And the passive, well, it's more secure. It's also harder to damage than the barcodes. So it's more secure. This is also a good benefit, depending what you attach the RFID tag onto. Next up, we have Tyler. We'll talk about Wi-Fi.
Alright, so Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi is widely used all over the world. You can go pretty much anywhere and connect to the Wi-Fi. And most people don't realize this when they think about Wi-Fi, but it can be used to locate things using a network of different access points. So, by using certain techniques of figuring out the distances between people and the different access points throughout the hospitals, you can locate the exact location in real time of these devices as long as you have a network connection. And this way of tracking is also very easy to set up. As long as you have an existing infrastructure for the network and it is strong enough to support this kind of data, it is incredibly easy to set up. There are tools all over the world where you can get them relatively easily. So there are, of course, the pros and cons of this too, however. So the pros, obviously, it's a widespread technology. There's Wi-Fi in the building right now. You can connect to it, and as long as you have a good enough network, you can very easily implement this, like I said earlier. All right? And however, there are cons. I mean, I'm sure that all of us have lived through an example of when the internet wasn't working. And that can be very frustrating, and in the case of if you're trying to track the location of vital data, that can be a horribly devastating issue to have. So, and it can be hard to make sure that this doesn't happen. To ensure this, you need to have a very well-maintained and costly Wi-Fi network, oftentimes much more powerful than the ones that most people would think that they would need to use, because it needs backups and just generally more access points than you would otherwise need. And also, it has been known that occasionally Wi-Fi, the frequency that Wi-Fi operates on, has been known to negatively affect some medical equipment. So that would have to be taken into consideration depending on what you're tracking and where you're tracking it. And then also there's Bluetooth. Bluetooth works in a similar way as Wi-Fi. However, most people, when they think of Bluetooth, you don't think of, well, how can I track something with Bluetooth? Usually you think of a smartwatch or a wireless headset or hands-free devices in cars. However, there's technology already today where, for example, it's known as the tile. It's a small thing that you put on your keychain and then you connect it to your phone and it will tell you where your keys are. And it can also make your keys ring by sounding an alarm. And this technology, if you use this in a network setup, can be used to figure out the exact positions of things within that network. So if you have a bunch of tags and then a bunch of sensors all over, you can figure out where anything is at any time. However, Bluetooth is also not perfect. It operates on the same frequency as Wi-Fi, so there are the issue of certain devices interfering with, or the Bluetooth interfering with certain devices. And also, anybody who's ever had an issue with Bluetooth becoming unconnected has known that it is very difficult and often time-consuming to get it reconnected and reset up. And so if you're using vital information again, if you lose connection, it could take anywhere from 1 minute to 20 minutes to an hour just to figure out how to reconnect it depending on the device. So those are some ways. And there is also infrared technology. This is the technology where oftentimes you'll see a picture of a heat map, and it works by sending a beam of light to a tag and then judging the distance on how it returns. And so, with infrared technology, you can use this information to track things. And there are some very, very good pros of this. It works in a similar way to RFID, almost exactly the same way with how it figures out how far away something is. And it can be used, and one sensor can be used to track multiple tags at the exact same time. There are examples where you can see videos of this happening on YouTube, where it's a bunch of little dots moving around a black screen, and it knows exactly the distance of each one of those dots all at the same time. And also, because of the fact that it uses light beams and well-established technology, there is no false reporting. You will never get it thinking that there's a tag when there isn't a tag. So, and there's also minimal interferences. So you don't have to worry about the frequencies interrupting anything, because instead of using radio frequencies, it uses light. Now, there are some cons to this. There are some cons to this. The biggest one is, since it uses light as the way of detecting where the tags are, you need a line of sight to whatever you are trying to look at. So if something goes around a corner, the sensor can no longer see it, and it no longer knows it's there. Unlike with Wi-Fi or Bluetooth, where as long as it's within the radius, they'll be able to figure it out. And also, one of the most inhibiting parts, or inhibiting cons of this, is that it is rather expensive and also quite difficult to set up. Especially in a large hospital, it takes a lot of time and a lot of money to get a bunch of sensors all over to make sure that they can see everything. All right, and now that we have talked about some of the technologies that would be used to actively track things, we would like to show you guys a video of how we think the normal flow would work.
We've done our best. Let's see if we can get these lights.
In the modern world, technology, especially within the healthcare industry, is evolving very rapidly. New devices and techniques can now allow for locating and tracking of personnel and medical equipment, such as beds, pumps, or medication. From interviews and research over the course of this project, the group was able to identify many practical uses for this type of system. We will show 3 scenarios where tracking and locating assets would be very useful. Here we see a patient in an emergency situation. Unable to do anything else himself, his friend exits the room to notify the nurse. The nurse enters the room, checks the patient, and knows that what's happening is beyond his skill set. The nurse looks around to try and find a doctor. Unfortunately, there do not appear to be any doctors nearby. Thanks to newly developed technology, the nurse is able to use an application on his phone to access the personnel locating system and can quickly locate and notify the doctor of the patient's condition. The doctor is then able to swiftly move to the patient's room and start helping. If necessary, the location data on the application could give the exact floor and room the employee is in. With this locating system, you eliminate time searching for and notifying doctors and personnel, so you are able to provide care to the patient much faster. You would also be able to identify when and where certain doctors are needed more frequently, allowing for more efficient allocation of personnel throughout the hospital. This technology also applies to nurses and any other employee that has a job that can be time sensitive. We now see a nurse tending to his normal duties when he receives a notification on his phone. This notification tells him that a patient from the psychiatric ward has wandered out of the hospital. He tells the nurse where the patient was last located and when the departure occurred. The nurse exits the hospital to retrieve the patient, something possible only because he was notified in real time. Through interviews with hospital staff, it was found that situations like this one do happen. Because of this tracking capability, the nurse is able to quickly and safely bring the patient back inside the hospital, disallowing the patient from putting himself or others in harm's way. Here we see an individual who has injured his leg enter the hospital. A nurse comes to tend to the patient, but is unable to find a wheelchair in the immediate vicinity. The nurse pulls out his phone and promptly locates and retrieves the wheelchair for the patient to use. Without the tracking system, the injured person would have to wait a much longer time to be moved and receive treatment. And that's that.
And now we can break for fika.
And another one was asking about how could you use an active tag to scan sterile equipment. So they're very similar questions. And we believe that because you can't put an RFID tag on each individual piece of equipment, obviously, it would get in the way, you wouldn't be able to wash it quite as well. The way that they do it now with the bins having the equipment in it and then the bins having the tags, we believe that if you did that with it, rather than completely overhauling the sterilization unit, we could rather just improve it by automating it so that people would no longer have to scan it and then look it up and then scan it. And we know that now, if they don't know what a piece of equipment is, too, they have, say they've never seen it before, it's a new piece of equipment, they have to go and they have to look it up and print a brand new tag for it and everything. Whereas the RFID tag would be able to take in that data as soon as the tag is made, which would be as soon as the new piece of equipment got into the hospital. All right, and also we have had another question about how serious is the interference with the medical devices, and does RFID not interfere with the medical devices? And from our research, we've seen that the seriousness, it's not incredibly serious, but it's similar to don't use networks on an airplane. You know, it's not something that is of vital importance and would definitely take down certain equipment, but it is something where there is that risk. And and also when it comes to RFID, from what we've seen, RFID there are some ways that it could interfere, but generally speaking, it is not as big a risk as Wi-Fi or Bluetooth devices. All right, and then we have had a question from Magnus of what would be the legal and ethical challenges with tracking assets from moving inside to outside of the hospital, and we're about to, in just a couple of minutes, get into more of the legal and security and ethical parts. So that should be answered pretty quickly, but if we don't get it quite, please just let us know and we'll explain it more at the end. Then Magnus also just asked, if money was not an issue, what would be the best combination of technologies for tracking patients and presenting that data to the staff? And we believe that it would be a combination of RFID tags and IR sensors in a way that has already been developed and implemented in other hospitals, and we'll talk more about that in just a little bit. And also there's other technology that we're about to go into now that is more abstract and is not so much of tracking specifically, but more of controlling and then researching based on that. So, without any further ado, I will put us back onto the slideshow.
May I ask you a question? Because I got inspired by one of the questions in the beginning. We're in this era now that we're going to use more and more artificial intelligence. Computers, they start learning things with. I wonder if you talk about all this equipment which is coming from sterile equipment. Why do we have to put a tag on it? I mean, if we learn a computer to recognize the equipment, we do not have to tag it. We just have to put a plate under a camera, and the camera recognizes
And,
all the equipment.
We are actually going to get to machine learning in just 2 slides.
Ah.
So without further ado, Sadie is going to take on some of these problems.
Good. So previously, we have been discussing some of the common technologies that use a tag and a sensor to track medical equipment and people throughout the hospital. The following technologies, as we kind of previewed just now, are somewhat different in their uses and how they work. The first technology which we're going to talk about is vending systems. Vending systems are automated dispensers that could hold anything from medical bandages to other consumables in a secure and controlled environment. A doctor or nurse could go up to any one of these machines and get an individual bandage in the same way they could get a soda from a vending machine like the one illustrated here. While vending machines can be slow and therefore should probably not be used to supply emergency equipment or emergency medications, they have many advantages in terms of how they keep track of supplies. From a lot of the, as we discussed earlier with the needs of the hospital in terms of supplies, it was hard for nurses to keep track of when they run out or when they might be running low, and then it can be difficult to process when they need to order more. With vending machines, they can maintain a count of the number of bandages or medical supplies left in the machine at all times, and can send messages warning staff of when they are running low and when it is time to refill without having to be checked on every time. They can also, from a security advantage with medication, they can only permit the nurses and doctors who are allowed to access certain controlled substances or other medications to access them, and keep those medications in an environmentally controlled environment so they do not go bad. With this information, from the records of how often the vending systems need to be resupplied, along with information from the tracking system, like where wheelchairs tend to be used and how often they tend to be used, this next technology, it can build off all this data which will be accumulated from the tracking of the technology. Machine learning, while a very technical term, is probably going to be as popular as artificial intelligence and the internet in the coming years. In 2014, Google declared itself to be a machine learning first technology company, meaning they were putting the top priority to research and development in machine learning as their central technology of focus. This illustrates how important machine learning will be in the coming decades. What is machine learning? To put it simply, you take a collection of data from all the tracking, for example, from all the tracking records, the vending systems records of when you needing to be resupplied and such, and fill them into a computer which can then process and find patterns and make predictions with this data. This could be anything from how often you really need to resupply something, for example, predicting when you may need to resupply something, to where or and how better to allocate your medical equipment, such as where to put wheelchairs so that they can be most readily available to the medical staff. There are almost endless possibilities for what you may discover from this data with systems like machine learning and data analysis. However, with keeping data, there are many dangers and concerns that need to be accounted for, which Li Dong will now discuss.
Thanks. Besides technology, we're concerned about data. A digital healthcare system generates and maintains during its daily usage. It requires and has to comply with regulations and security, or it will fail at the very beginning, before its usage, no matter how advanced technology it may attain. So let's start with regulations. Our team did a thorough research on laws and policies on digitalization at both international and national levels. And here, we'd like to talk about the Personal Data Act, the Swedish regulation, PDA, and the European Union General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. And for GDPR, it has several basic facts: direct applicability, wide influence, and top penalty. Direct applicability means General Data Protection Regulation will come into effect in Sweden on May 25th, 2018, 5 months from now, without any need for implementing national legislation. And its wide influence does not only contain the 28 state members, but all other countries that have a connection with the European Union. And in Sweden, the PDA will be replaced by General Data Protection Regulation, which means there will be no escape for all Swedish IT systems existing or under development from GDPR. And its top penalty would probably be one of the biggest reasons why developers and their clients cannot ignore this standard. The top fine, 40 million euro or 4% of the total annual turnover of organization, is a large number. So it is an essential regulation. Let's see what it's about. General Data Protection Regulation. We can see some keywords like data and protection. GDPR has a high requirement of sensitive data, like healthcare information, which contains 3 types: health, biometric, and geometric. And all these kinds of information are very common in a hospital environment. And after defining what sensitive data is, GDPR says every organization has to take responsibility to protect such sensitive information. And we will talk about the security issue later. And now let's see a connection between GDPR and a hospital positioning system. As is known, a hospital positioning system is unlike a regular map app like Google Maps. We need to track the patients or medical staff. That means we should know where they are and whom we are tracking at. This process concerns position and identity data. And identity information is a highly sensitive one. And in this scenario, GDPR is applicable. So the hospital has to take its responsibility to protect such information from cyber attack all system errors. But how? Let's start with security. Actually, GDPR, again, gives a very specific and detailed instruction for security. First is anonymization, making the data unintelligible by using technologies like encryption. And what's more important is the data breach notification. Every organization is required to assign someone to take the responsibility of data protection compliance. He needs to, when he finds a data breach, he needs to report to a superior authority about such kind of risk with no undue delay. But are they tough enough? No. Legality and security are very hard to please. That is why we do as much as we can to list these following suggestions. Let's start with decoupling. This is a software engineering terminology aiming at reduce the interdependence between data. And in our case, we divide the position and the identity data into two subsystems. So our positioning system only needs to care about how to track the devices, like wearable devices or our wheelchairs. And for the question like whom these devices belong to, we leave this question to a medical health system. In this way, the highly sensitive information are left to the medical system. And then our positioning system is a relatively lowly sensitive one. And in this way, this does not necessarily have to comply with GDPR. But of course, it is not a cure for all. Sensitive data still exists in a hospital system. That is why we give a second suggestion, a wide survey. According to the County Council directive, we've noted that it has already been working on it. And it mentioned a collaboration with other county councils, but it does not give some detailed information like how it is going to do this collaboration. And according to our research, we get an official document, Vision eHealth in 2025. That is published by the Swedish government in 2016. Two organizations, the Innovation System and the Healthcare Agency, are responsible to do a survey as preparation. And GDPR is also their task too. So we just believe there will be an ideal collaboration and partnership between the Uppsala County Council and these two organizations for their abundant resources and information. And the last one is also very important, negotiation. GDPR requires a data breach report, but it does not specify the roles of a data controller, an IT system, a hospital, or a superior organization. So we're afraid that when the data breach really happens, it might turn out to be a circumstance where everyone tries to skirt his responsibility. So conflicts are inevitable. That is why we suggest our hospital talk and negotiate with developers or engineers on how we share our responsibilities in GDPR. And by doing so, it would be much easier to implement a hospital positioning system or other kinds of digital health system in the future. And that is all about our findings of regulation and security. Now let's invite Seiji to share some stories that we learned from other hospitals. Thank you.
So Uppsala Academic Hospital is not the only hospital that is considering or has implemented a tracking system for their medical equipment, supplies, personnel, and patients. In 2012, the Johns Hopkins University Hospital in Maryland, United States, implemented a real-time locating system for their medical personnel and equipment. In their system, they used a combination of technologies, including RFID, infrared, and Wi-Fi, as discussed previously. They found that a system with a combination of technologies allowed them to take advantages of the strengths of each of these technologies and have redundancies in case of interference or failure. One of the features of their system was to set up power levels or an expected amount of equipment in each area. For example, setting a level of requiring 15 wheelchairs at some entrance. They then had a display at that entrance which would show whether the area was below power, where it would have too few wheelchairs, therefore the medical staff would be alerted that they needed to bring back wheelchairs to the entrance, or above par, meaning that they had too many wheelchairs and that they had some wheelchairs which belonged elsewhere and should be returned. They also implemented a system of room rounding logs. These were records which showed how often and how a piece of equipment was used in the area it was assigned to. For example, if with the 15 wheelchairs at the entrance, the room rounding log would show how many wheelchairs on average were actually used at that entrance. If it was only 5 wheelchairs that were used at that entrance, they would be able to use that information to maybe relocate those wheelchairs to where they would be more usefully put. The University of California, San Diego Medical Center in California, United States, also worked on implementing a tracking system. Before they had a tracking system, the hospital staff would tend towards taking more equipment than they needed for longer periods than they actually needed to use that for, because they were uncertain if they returned them to the central distribution center that they would be able to get them back when they needed it, because of a lack of being able to keep track of their equipment. For example, they would take out one of their examples was having more IV pumps out than at a station than necessary at that station. With implementing their tracking system, they needed to change the culture of the hospital staff around holding onto equipment, to encourage them to trust the new system that they could return the equipment such as IV pumps to their central distribution center, and that it would be available when they came back. This also allowed the hospital administrators to get a better sense of how much equipment they actually needed at any time, and so that they could purchase more if necessary, or reduce or not have to have as many, and which saved the hospital significant amount of money. Another effect of the tracking system was simply they did not need to spend a lot of time looking for the equipment when they needed to try to return it, when they needed for it to be returned to the central distribution, because they would know where it is. However, the hospital found it was unnecessary to track every piece of equipment individually. They thought it was better to have aggregate numbers of the equipment at the locations, such as the power levels used at Johns Hopkins, rather than having the location of every wheelchair in that entrance area. They found this, they recorded these numbers rather than locations of each individual item, because it would discourage possible laziness that they could just leave out a piece of equipment and come back to it because they could just look it up, instead of returning it as they were supposed to its proper location. Finally, when considering what to track throughout the hospital, they found that they considered that it was not only the cost of the equipment that should determine whether or not they should track it, but also how important the item was and how much it tended to get lost. For example, they attached a tracking chip tag to the cell phone of the head nurse at their emergency room, and the tracking chip cost more than the cell phone itself, but they found it was more important for the head nurse to always be able to find their cell phone and or make any emergency calls than to not be able to. And so it was worth putting a more expensive tracker on the real-time tracker on that cell phone. And now we will conclude.
Yes, we certainly will. So, I want to talk to you all about the future work to be done in this project. So a lot of these details have to do with implementation. So of course this was a high-level design sort of project. But once again, here's some future work to be done. So where and how patient equipment and data will be stored such that compliance with relevant legislation is maintained, as Lee Dong discussed. Those are all implementation details, as in, is there going to be some secure server somewhere? How are individuals going to be authenticated into that server? Things of that nature. So what technologies should be used for particular items, as let's take the wheelchair example. Well, should we put Bluetooth on the wheelchair? Should we put Wi-Fi? Should we put infrared and Wi-Fi? Should we put Bluetooth? So on and so forth. All of those combinations should be looked through and then decided. While we have said that the RFID and IR combination is successful, there may be a better or still the same but less expensive alternative. The physical tracking equipment necessary for each technology has not been considered, as in how much space will this take up when it is on the equipment itself? Is it going to be a big box that makes the equipment unwieldy, or will it be a very small chip that can just be slapped on the bottom of this piece of equipment and stay out of the way? Cost for each technology has also not been reviewed fully, which means that individuals looking to purchase this equipment will need to get quotes from companies that manufacture and do this sort of thing. So, with that said, it's time for discussion and questions. Once again, we thank you for this opportunity. So, we still have some more questions here, but if there's anybody else who wants to ask a question in person or right now, feel free to do so. Otherwise, I'll just present these new ones. I see none appearing. All right. So here's this one right here, and you gentlemen can just pop up and answer whatever if I say anything wrong. So you can read that there. Give me a second to read the question. So, which system do you believe is the most cost-effective, reliable, and easy for the staff not interested in technology to use in the areas? In the areas of why? I feel like I should. Oh my, that's not good. Excuse me. I'm not sure if those
continues to that's what you put together.
Ah, yes, okay. To use in the areas of supplies, equipment, and people. Alright. So, I think Tyler, you would be expert if you could take this one.
So the question was again, which do we believe is the most cost-effective and relevant for people not so versed in the technology? And as we said in the future work, we don't know exactly how much it would cost the hospital to implement each of these things. We do know relative pricing, such as infrared is the most expensive, typically for tracking with a sensor, and barcodes are generally the least expensive. Wi-Fi and Bluetooth those both depend on the systems that are already in place, such as if you have a hospital, if the hospital here has a very, very strong Wi-Fi network and is very fast and able to handle a lot of data all at once, you wouldn't need to get very much new equipment because you already have enough. However, if it's a somewhat older system, maybe a slower system with not quite enough network capabilities, you would have to possibly purchase a lot of access points and a lot more networking supplies. And then also there is the implementation cost, and we're not entirely sure how much a system would cost to create, such as the software behind it. That is something that we tried to get a hold of, but it turned out that we actually did not have nearly enough information about the hospital or the specific needs that would be hashed out in the negotiation table. So, I think, does that answer it for anybody else? Any other questions? Yes?
Yeah, I was thinking about this map. If you're going to track things, maybe you need to have a digital map of every room, every ward, every entrance, or is that a condition that is to be in place at first?
It is. Seiji, did you guys?
Go ahead, Sid.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
So you can create a digital map. On the technical side, you can create a digital map of the hospital. But if you have sensors which can be identify what room it's in, you can draw a picture of the hospital and just write where that room is to indicate what room it is in. Something like the active RFID tag can get an even more precise location than just what room it is in, in which case you might be interested in the digital map.
And
However, barcodes cannot get would be harder to get a much more precise thing. So general room or general group of rooms would be an easier way to go about that.
And that's also one thing that the team would also consider an implementation detail, as in, would you want just a textual representation of the floor in the room, or would you like the specific map and the location? Would you like it to be 3D? Do you just want it to be like a top-down isometric view of the floors, almost like a video game of sorts, but except on every floor from the top down? So that would be like, again, an implementation.
And one final mention is the Johns Hopkins system. They did not have a map. What they had was a display in the area saying, we have 15 wheelchairs here, we have several doctors here, this is in what is in this area. You will be able to find it here. And if you do not have, if there are 0 wheelchairs here, then you will need to find a wheelchair elsewhere or such.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Obviously, it would be easier for the patient in question if they want to find a way around the hospital to know whether or not they should go in this direction or this direction. And in that case, yes, a virtual map of the hospital itself would be really practical to have from that perspective. Of course, the staff here at the hospital.
Does that answer the question? All right, you, sir.
Yes, okay, I got another question. Thank you guys for great work and good presentation. And I'm wondering, the systems that you have looked into, do they have another information added, like the status of equipment? Like the position is sometimes, or mostly in my experience, useful when you can combine it with another information, like the status, for example, of staff. What kind of expertise does the doctor have? Is it a surgeon or a medical doctor? And that kind of information. The system combined, have you seen any efficient system that combine those information, the positioning information combined with other data?
So, yes, the system can combine the information along with the identity of the person or the in use or not in use of a piece of equipment with their current location. There are some security concerns, as Libon mentioned, with how that information is then stored. It should probably be stored, as he suggested, separately with decoupling. However, for example, the Johns Hopkins system had the ability to know where the nurses were in the area, and if a patient pressed the call nurse button, it would notify the nearest nurse to them, and then it would mark that nurse as busy. And so if another patient would press the call nurse button, it would notify a different nurse, but the nearest nurse that it could find who was not busy, and direct them to the patient. And it would also be able to note that the nurse was handling it by the nurse's proximity to the patient who pressed the call nurse button, and mark them as in a session or once they leave the patient, no longer busy.
Okay, and that sounds great. I mean, for the inventory of the wheelchairs, as you could get an example, do they keep track of like air pressure in the tires and stuff like that? You usually have 15 wheelchairs, but there's only 6 really usable of them. If you don't try it, we check them and so on. Did you see anything of that in the
So I did not see that. It marked the wheelchair as in use when it left the place where it's supposed to be stored, but I did not see that. For the vending system, it was able to determine such as expiration date of medication or supplies, and be able to tell you, you don't need to resupply us because we're running low, you need to resupply because it's going to expire. And different features like that I saw in the vending systems example.
Okay, thank you.
Well, you have one of the solutions you're suggesting for solving these problems with distributing equipment and stuff and so on is the vending machines and so on. Last year, when your colleagues, your students were presenting their material, they had drones. Do you call them drones? Yeah.
Aerial.
Yeah. I liked it because it's a very easy way, just those small ones to track things and to fix things. How do you think there would be enough information in this kind of systems you're suggesting to instruct drones? If a wheelchair is gone,
So
can a drone get it back?
So one of the more far-fetched considerations which we did get to in some of our discussions and research was, as it's probably much harder to implement, is the idea of incorporating robotics, not exactly drones, but to have self-driving wheelchairs that could drive themselves back, or when you need to resupply something, that a machine would accept the package and bring it to the vending system or the cabinet where it's supposed to go and put the supplies where it belongs. Technology for that is under construction. There are many companies which are working hard on trying to develop technologies like that. They are still in the production phase. We are trying to build these technologies still, and are at this time very expensive.
So no wheelchairs.
No driving on the
No self-driving wheelchairs. Yeah,
Tesla wheelchairs.
but maybe in the future. Definitely I would see within this next 20, 30 years. Decade.
Yeah, well, you touched the subject of video analyzing programs. Did you see any examples of that when they use, like, for example, you can find a bag standing alone on an airport, that kind of technology, you could use that in some sort of tracking.
Yeah.
Did you see an example of it?
So we did come across it in our research. A major concern with that is that people can find it has a lot of privacy concerns with recognizing, because it can systems like that can recognize that there is a wheelchair being left out alone. It can also It could also be used to identify patients, doctors, nurses, and every last individual, and not just like have a location piece of data, but have a visual picture of who they are, and that's extremely hard to disconnect identity with location at that point. So it can be very privacy invasive. but that is something where the visual recognition is a growing technology, image recognition, but it has a lot of privacy concerns.
Yes, that's an interesting question. If you could keep it inside a machine and just let the machine look at some things, and you can guarantee that it's only the machine that handling the data, maybe the individual don't feel the integrity problem. But
that is one of the things with machine learning. Machine learning is kind of an interesting technology in that you give the computer the data. After you give it an example of something, you ask it to point out more examples of that, and it does it on its own. It's hard for even computer science to figure out what it's doing. It's a bit much.
But I have seen one area of application which is very, very nice. Have you seen the little robot which is called Pepper? It's a little white robot which people are which they are testing on, for example, on the children's hospital. And it recognizes children, and even if they haven't been there for 2 months, and the little child is getting in, it's asking, "Hi, Ted, how are you doing today? How was it? Do you still like your dinosaurs and so on?" Because it remembers, and then so if you use it in the right way, and also old people who are getting dementia, they can. It's a very good way of training their memory because they learn to know the person. But it should be used, as you said, in the right way.
Yes.
That's the problem.
I believe personally they would be used in specific niche areas. So not that large scale would be applicable in every area of the hospital, so to speak. But again, as you mentioned, in those kind of areas, they would be really applicable. But again, further services.
It isn't technology. It's a growing technology still. It certainly looks like it can be very well implemented here.
So I think we have one more question here. So from Magnus, so we're going to go ahead and present. When it comes to incremental implementation of physician capability at the hospital, what types of assets would be the #1 priority to locate/track and why? So again, jump in whenever you like, but I'll So the ones that are life-saving, the ones that are most time-sensitive are the technologies, or rather the assets to track first, because, well, if you can save a patient's life, that's the whole point of the hospital. So individuals such as doctors or physicians or surgeons, individuals like that would be a first priority in determining who to track or who to implement this system on first. So I don't know if you gentlemen have anything to add in terms of equipment.
So I could add something. With the University of California, San Diego, they did a consideration of what they should track, and they considered its vitalness as in terms of life saving, such as the ER nurses, the emergency room nurses, a cell phone, two things which would get lost very readily, or misplaced quite easily. They also made the note, which I forgot to mention, but unfortunately with implementing a locating system, they found it was important to have it applied to as much of the campus as possible, because if something is going to get lost, it is probably not going to get lost where it belongs. So it does not make too much use to put a locating system only where it belongs, but to cover as much ground as possible so that you can find where it has gone off to. That. Anybody has comments on this? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, just to follow up, this could be a good place for a good work with the use cases then, to see what are the common use cases where, or the most urgent ones where you need a location technology. perhaps wheelchairs, perhaps EKG apparatus and so on.
Yes, and that is we found in our interviews with medical staff at Uppsala Academic Hospital, we discussed wheelchairs. We discussed EKGs. We discussed the fluid pumps. That is something which a possible survey of the medical staff to have that data all collected. We collected a whole bunch of that in our report. Maybe even more thorough survey of what the medical staff thinks they lose all the time or they can't find often. And then ranking that for an implementation. I do not have the report in front. It has a much more thorough discussion of what we discovered through our interviews. I can
Also want to add something to that. During our interviews, we noticed a theme, and that was that the people, the staff we interviewed, mentioned that the surgeons and the doctors had the habit of not liking when they were precisely tracked. That was also noteworthy to mention.
Are there any data on how much time savings it can be through using a positioning system for equipment? I mean, how much administration or running around looking for
exact time?
Yeah.
We talked in our interviews, and we found that a common theme is that it will take anywhere from 5 minutes to an hour maybe to find the equipment that they're needing. And it's in those times that the life-threatening things could happen. And with an automated system, it would be almost instant. You would be able to just look it up and say, there's the thing that I need, or there's the person I need, or there's the patient that wandered off.
And how often does it happen?
Pretty often. Yeah, especially in our interviews with the reception people, and the reason why we use the wheelchair example so often is because they say that they are constantly looking for wheelchairs. It's multiple times per hour that they have to go look for.
And at that point, once you have the location, it's simply a matter of going to it and then putting it back where it belongs, as opposed to, oh, no, it's not here, oh, no, it's not here. So, and again, 5 minutes to an hour it is a large range, but it all depends on where it actually gets placed. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to find an exact number, but of course it's a lot of time.
Exactly. And what matters is that at the end, time is saved, and lives are saved as well.
I will mention, unfortunately, the other hospitals were not as giving with information like how badly it was, it took, how long it took them to find stuff, to then how long it took. That data was not easy to find from them in terms of how effective it was. They own the articles on the other hospitals' implementation only had notes from nurses saying, I spent so much less time looking for things. No, like, not that specific, unfortunately.
So here's a really important question. Can we get copies of the slides that were presented for me? Absolutely. We will supply them to Gita, who will distribute them as needed if you'd be so kind. So, yes, definitely. Here's another. Or yes, please.
Well, I'm not so good at sending questions. But have you seen in your studies, in your literature, also examples on where it didn't work out well, which were things we should avoid if we're going to implement this kind of positioning? What should we avoid?
So one horror story, and again, feel free to jump in. Was it here at Uppsala? Yes, where the hospital attempted to implement something with Wi-Fi, but the Wi-Fi's infrastructure was not up to par. So as soon as you walked down the hall, you lost connection, and then everything was messed up and
cost a lot of money. And
yes,
the failure.
Exactly. So in respect to Wi-Fi, one thing to avoid is bad infrastructure, but of course that is a very, very costly investment to make. So that's just one case though.
And then, as I mentioned, with the University of California in San Diego, one of their issues which they had when implementing tracking each individual device was it turned out to be that medical staff would not just leave it out, knowing that they could just look it up instead of returning the device to where it belonged. A bit of laziness, and so they were concerned about that, and they had to work on. They tried to say, "Oh, we'll only tell you how many devices in the area, rather than where each individual device was, to encourage them to return it." But yeah, that was one other bad thing.
So implementing a system like this turns people working from being based on experience where the wheelchairs are located normally, or some sort of tacit knowledge that we have in an organization. Now it goes into technology, right? So is it combining different techniques, because we can be also very sensitive, because most systems fail, and that can create a critical situation. So is that your solution, that we need to combine not one technology but actually two?
Yeah.
Or what?
So both the University of San Diego and Johns Hopkins went with the combining of multiple technologies because of the dangers of when one technology fails or another. So that is a major point with tracking the. Also, in the sense with the University of California's idea of getting the medical staff back into a pattern of returning items to where they belong so that they'll be available. In theory, if they just continue to return items and then take them out, it will if the technology encourages them to return the item, that would leave, so if a blackout for just a short amount of time, they would still return the item, and they would still be able to just take it back out, because there would be like a new sense of returning and taking it. Building a new culture around handling the equipment is something that they work on.
Yes.
I have a question. Due to that location thing, do you think during your studies have you found out that already there is enough information to just put in the technology to locate? So if you put the tag on the wheelchair, is there enough location information through the net or the space, already that you would locate it, or is it some more information needed about the buildings, structure, elevators, etc.?
And that would be one consideration, as in another implementation detail is where specifically should we put this sensor, or for instance this infrared light beam, like if it were up in the corner then it could see throughout the whole room, as opposed to like putting it down here or something. That wouldn't make a lot of sense. So learning about the structure and where to place each individual sensor or tag would be a very good thing to do.
So for most of the technologies, they involve both a tag on the device and a sensor to communicate with that tag. A lot of the time, once you have the sensors set up, all that the tag which needs to do is you have to tell the system what item is on that tag, is being tagged by that item, and then it can just fall into the system, and the system can already locate it. But it is the setting up of the sensors which can be the more costly in terms of infrastructure.
Again, just as I mentioned on my slide, when it came to the Japanese hospital, they already had a combination of the scanning of the barcodes and RFID. So technology-wise, you could do it incrementally, so to speak. So you have the barcode, you can scan it or do that. And then the next step would be, for example, integrating the RFID and starting from there. Because then you will be less of a risk really to having the same mistake and fiasco with the Wi-Fi incident last year, which was on a massive scale. So we've taken small iterations and expanded from there.
We have another question on the computer from Maggie. Have you stumbled upon any trends when it comes to standards/protocols within the field of tracking? So in terms of patterns or repeating things, not particularly. I mean, the technologies that are used are fairly similar, or, well, the same kinds of technologies, as well as how the data is stored, although each country has various legislation. Although I don't think we did too much research on the other countries' legislation, as it would not apply here. So I have a few gentlemen have any to add. I don't think we found any real patterns or protocols within protocols or standards like that. So yes, go ahead.
One of the major patterns, and this is also in our report, was the definition that when it comes to tracking people, at least, consent is an absolute must. And it is one of those things where it's in legislation, even in the GDPR, I believe, that when you're tracking people, at least, or things that can easily be tied to people, the person who's being tracked needs to know and needs to be okay with it. So one of the major trends in an issue that could be caused is people don't want to be tracked, and there's the issue of trying to convince them that it's okay, this data is stored in a safe way, no one's going to be able to access it, and it's only used for the right purposes. So that's at least a trend that I saw.
Exactly, yeah, that is true, at least legislation-wise. We have another question. Any here before I present this one? I see none. Okay. Are there any future technologies to expect that are promising? So in terms of future technologies, drones, those are super cool. So that's we're really hoping that one day that would be something, as in you see the drone flying to pick up the wheelchair and just drop it off at the location or something like that. So in terms of the closer future though, artificial intelligence and machine learning are cutting edge technologies that are currently being implemented all across the world right now. So I think one of the latest news was one of Google's AI learned how to beat everybody in chess in 2 hours or something like that. So these technologies are so potent and just so, it's super crazy and they're super cool. But in terms of application to the hospital, as Seiji mentioned during his machine learning slide, you could use this information to predict and find patterns as to where certain assets are lost and perhaps where they can be found, because you know where they were lost, so you know the relative location and then can go retrieve them. Yes, sir.
So you said a couple of times drones picking up wheelchairs and moving them there. Do you see drones as being effective indoors versus outdoors?
So here's an interesting consideration that last year's group, the future of healthcare, what they, one topic that they touched on, and that was also drones, but of course in the outdoor areas. So instead of having an ambulance go to the injured party, wherever they are on the street, say a car accident occurred and they're attempting to get responders on the scene, instead they could just fly a drone out and have eyes on the location or a camera filming the location saying, and the doctor saying, okay, this is actually what happened. We can't get there right now because there's a traffic jam or something, but here's, we can start giving instructions perhaps through the drone that says, here, this is what you should do in order to ensure that this person can stay alive, or here's some information to get them to a place where first responders can reach them. Again, though, that is quite far in the future and speculation at this point.
Well, drones flying about inside may not be the most practical solution.
I agree.
Some of the concepts which we came across were included self-driving wheelchairs which could find their way back to where they belong and to come to the patient at the door rather than having to go find the wheelchair and bring them to it. Along with, there was a concept designed for a food cart which could monitor the status of the food inside it while it was moving, while it was trying to get food to the patients which it needed to, and would alert if any food had gone bad inside it, along with just that the food cart was automated and was just bringing food to each patient on its way. Yeah, but kind of alert when the nurse was no longer paying attention to the food cart.
I'm resting in a question, maybe it's not about the future, but actually if you look at the other hospitals that you described in the US, have you seen also that this kind of tracking, positioning technology has been used for management purposes, besides change the culture, habits, etc., but actually for finding out how much resources are allocated to a patient, the intensity of the amount of people around the patient, for instance. Have you come upon anything like
So we haven't come across that. The University of San Diego Medical Center, one of the things which they did on the management side was by keeping track of how often they used a lot of equipment which they rented from companies. They would have it out on the loan, and they found by keeping track of the equipment, but they could reduce the amount of equipment they had out at a time, with saving costs on equipment. That's to the extent that I found with their application of management of equipment.
not management of people?
Management of people, I did not come across management of people that, in terms of monitoring how much time they would spend with a patient. But, yeah.
Well, I've seen material where when you put a tracker on, for example, a nurse, and then you can see, you get this, they call it a spaghetti diagram. You can see where you optimally can put different kind of functions, because if they're walking very often long distance to get to the drugs or to get to some other, for example, there was they noticed that it was very smart to put the drugs room beside the kitchen, because when the patient needs a tablet, they often need a glass of water as well. So then they don't have to walk a long distance. So of course you can optimize the way you're constructing your buildings by tracking those people.
And in relation to the concentration of individuals or people, there was the PAR levels concept that Seiji talked about at one of the previous hospitals, or the hospitals where a previous system was created. So,
and now I forget which hospital it was, but one of the two hospitals the Johns Hopkins Hospital, their system would was designed to encourage the closer nurses to respond to situations, rather than just all the nurses or picking at random, to allow for a shorter travel distance. In terms of making sure that the nurse's time is used most effectively.
let's see, Johns Hopkins was the one that did conduct the PAR levels. Yes.
There is actually one kind of technology being implemented at Arlanda Airport. They want to follow people from check-in to security and so on, to see in real time that the flows are working and whether there are assets needed in order to get the flow going if it piles up. And that is a system that measures, and obviously it needs to be very integrity preserving. So it's a system that measures body height. And it's been proven that that's enough to follow single individuals and see what the flow is like actually. So it could be a thing for sort of the big flow of people.
And I mean, this flow of people, if you record if you record where the nurse is throughout the day, along with their kind of immediate task throughout the day, which could be identified through, for example, when giving medication, with the barcodes example, they would record that they were doing, that it was the patient they were giving it to, and the medication they were giving, and who was giving it. With that kind of data, this is where a software like machine learning could come into handy by making predictions on, like, at this time there'll be a lot of patients getting medication, so you should have multiple more nurses there than other times, and you can really get some interesting patterns and predictions out of data, the analysis of that kind of data, both human analysis and computerized analysis.
Oh, Magnus says thank you for a great presentation.
I was